there may well be things that you disagree with or you have alternative views about. So please do chip in. And then at the end, there's plenty of time for us to discuss anything that you'd like to. We can have a group discussion rather than me necessarily giving all the answers. So these are very much my opinions. So I'll talk a bit about answering the questions, but also talking about the process of how to generate interesting thoughts about style and what style is at A-level compared to GCSE, and then some thoughts about the essays as well. But my predominant focus is on the 15 markers and on how to look at what style means in a slightly broader sense than probably has been met at GCSE, much less mechanical at A-level. So I hope that sounds okay. I know that Hannah will circulate this PDF later on as well. Firstly, it's worth thinking about the massive difference in what an A-level commentary requires compared to a GCSE. And I wasn't at the GCSE session just now, but so I'm probably going to be quite irreverent and flippant about it. But the gulf of what a lit crit answer means at GCSE to A-level is quite marked, I think. And that's a good thing because I think it makes it less mechanical and less formulaic and more interesting, essentially, to do and to teach. But also it means that there's a bit less guidance out there about how to approach it. Because if you think about the GCSE, the 8-mark question, you can get through it and get fantastic scores by making separate points, which are nice and discrete about particular sentences or even words. The question is going to be very limited in its focus. It might only be about 9 or 10 lines or fewer. You can do the style jumping through hoops and be naming your lit crit points and all of your devices and ticking them off, and your similes and your alliterations and things, and that will get you mechanically to an 8-mark score if you want. And also the answers are quite short, and you can do all of that in a relatively succinct number of lines. And it's often the case, isn't it, that you see GCSE candidates waffling on and on and on and not actually getting that many marks, whereas someone who's a bit more sharp at the lit crit can do it in 10 lines and get 8 marks very easily. So if that's kind of the GCSE, then what's the nature of the beast at A-level? And my thoughts were as follows, and please feel free to chip in with other ideas. So by contrast, unlike at GCSE, where you can essentially get away with cherry picking some points, a good A-level lit crit does require you to have a sense of the whole text and each passage within it. So just working down here, this idea of the helicopter view, where you can talk about a whole sentence and not just pick on a word or two. The idea, crucially, because the question is going to have a much broader wording to it, it might simply be, how is this bit interesting, essentially, or dramatic? That requires you to think about the value of a whole passage and to think about paragraphs as they come, or chunks of 15 lines as coherent wholes, rather than just the cherry-picking style. The crucial thing, I think, worth stressing out of anything, more than anything else today, is that at A-level, content is definitely the most important thing to be prioritizing on in terms of your literature. Why is it interesting? You read it not because you're looking for style points. People read things and listened to things because they wanted to be entertained by the actual content. And if the content was entertaining, almost invariably, there's something worth pointing out about the style connected to a content point. So leading with content at A-level. Because answers are longer, making your own structure is key in a lit crit response. So I think even though technically you don't have to do an introduction, having an introduction is absolutely vital, because it tells the examiner, I guess, functionally, that you know what you're talking about. But more importantly, it focuses your own mind as a writer, as a student, in terms of what you're going to have to focus on in the next side and a half of writing. So having your introduction, and then you can choose to work through either sequentially or thematically, and both are fine, and both are routes to getting full marks. But it requires more thought, doesn't it, as a writer? and you've got, say, 20 odd minutes, 25 minutes maybe, to do a 15 marker, and a big blank sheet of A4 in front of you, and a paragraph to comment on. So having the introduction is vital. And then, of course, at A level, you've got the extra, I guess, aspect that having a greater, more nuanced awareness of context, historical, cultural, is an extra added thing you can weave into a lit crit. It's not going to be your primary focus of your answer, but it may well come in at times. So all of those make it a much more sophisticated challenge, if you like, but also much more interesting. So, as I said, the number one takeaway, if you have to leave with anything, is that content is more important, is primary to style. And style is just the sort of handmaiden, the way to make juicy content still juicier, essentially, in language that I often use with students myself. As I say, no one looks at a text to cherry pick for alliteration or assonance or anaphora. They're the things that enliven an already important bit of text, which an author has chosen, therefore, to enliven. So A-level, in some ways, involves getting students to appreciate that and acknowledge that, and to get them out of the habit of mechanical literary device spotting, which, as I said, serves them very well at GCSE. So in a way, you're rehabilitating the idea that talking about content is not only important, but it's like primary in terms of enjoyment of a text and appreciation of a text. And we often miss that when we're sort of train spotting for your literate devices. But it involves a question of zooming out, because you're looking at what is this paragraph doing? What is this sentence doing within a paragraph? Not just what's the lit crit aspect of this particular word. It doesn't mean you're ditching the style, quite the contrary, but it's making those style points make much more sense, because they are, of course, augmenting some already interesting content. I think that looking at English is a very useful thing to do to practice this idea. So it could be that you take a recent political speech by a Joe Biden in Poland, and you look at, right, let's think about what is the content of this and how is style being used to augment it, always leading with the content. It could be that if there are hymns in your school, or if there are song lyrics, looking at what a verse is trying to do, as well as then thinking about style. Looking at English poetry, if any of your students also do English A-level. Fantastic for number one, what is the actual content saying? And then looking at style, secondary. Or looking at texts that are really technical, like legal type texts in English, and that's great preparation for something like a Cicero, where he's trying to sneak in arguments as well as dress them up in interesting language. But content is always king, I think, and essentially that needs to be the thing on which everything else is predicated at A-level, because style points hang off already noteworthy text. So then the question is, what makes a good 15-mark commentary? These are things that are certainly important. They're not necessarily the only important things. We mentioned a couple of them already. Having a clear intro, which gives a sense of the purpose, essentially, even though it's a bit formulaic to talk in terms of purpose, of what the whole passage is about. Blending your content all the way through, blending your content and your style, but leading with the content, because that's going to be where the most interesting points are located. And this is a really important one, covering a whole extract. Now, if you look at some recent Latin past papers, for example, often the selection of lines for the 15 marker goes across a paragraph break, or includes 2 or 3 lines at the end, which are actually separate from the main. I mean, they might be a continuation of, but they might be a contrast to as well. And covering those lines too, and not ignoring them because they are inconveniently on the wrong or a different theme, is really vital. And it shows that you're, again, thinking in terms of that zoomed out way. Some linking back to a question, but you don't have to absolutely hammer it. I mean, if you're answering always about the language being dramatic and interesting, and of course using synonyms for that, you are inherently answering the question. So you don't have to constantly keep on saying, and thus I'm answering the question, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone has been told otherwise by an examiner, but I don't think it's required at A-level. Making points that actually are powerful and cogent and have value, not just the train spotting of lit-crit devices, because as I say, they're always going to be highlighting things that are worth talking about anyway. The next one is vital. If you've got people up against it time-wise, you could write books about a paragraph, each paragraph of Cicero or Thucydides, and the commentaries are really long and extensive, but of course you've got to prioritize your absolute key points. So you can't say everything in the time, and getting the main things across is the priority. But if and that links with the next thing, if you're adept at making star points, they can be made very quickly in just a half a line. And you can say, oh, and this is highlighted by a superlative here, by the way, which is of course a star point, but made in a very almost in passing way. And finally, if that's something I've increasingly, I guess, thought about in recent years, I think it's better to quote pairs or short phrases, pairs of words or short phrases often, than just quoting isolated words. Of course, isolated words can sometimes be really powerful if they are buzzwords in Latin, for example, ratio or furor, for example. But quoting pairs of words is a mechanism to guard against not basically missing out on the interesting bit, because people are looking for the types of phrasing that set up the interesting bit. And the example I put here, people latch onto like non solum sed etiam, but that's not the interesting bit. The interesting bit is what comes with that. So not only X, but the Y. X and Y are much more interesting than the not only but also. But of course, you're not only but also is signposting that there is a contrast, but the contrast, the X and Y. And if you quote groups of words, your three words, non solum X, sed etiam Y, you're preventing that risk, or you're lessening that risk of missing out on the juiciest points, because you're really just looking for the signposting. Now, I put here some suggestions of how you can, I guess, build up to some of these or practice some of these. These are essentially just off the top of my head and a few ideas that have worked well over recent years, but there may be lots more of your own. I think having always the aim of a passage in mind is absolutely vital, because if you think they could pick any 10 lines of the Latin or Greek, you need to be adept at articulating what's the point of that 10 or 15 lines. So having a margin where you're making essentially full, you're making it full of mini synopses and mini expressions of the author's aim is the most useful, I think, single way to help structure thinking about a whole text. So what's Cicero doing in this paragraph? What's Cicero doing in these 5 lines? Having different, essentially, lengths of passages on which you're commenting is very helpful as you're reading the text. So you're practicing that sense of articulating an author's aim right from the off. In marking, this is the second point down on the right-hand side. In terms of the marking, I've actually simplified how I mark 15 markers over the years, and I'll put in the margin on the left simply C or S for, is this a valid or a interesting content point, and is this an interesting style point? And it becomes rapidly clear to a student whether they're focusing on one or the other, and it also becomes rapidly clear whether they are blending the two, because your ideal point is going to be a lovely blend of content and style. Cicero describes Sacia as X and Y, and the contrast here, that's your style. It helps to illustrate this. So marking that is simply CNS, I think, has worked really well. And then at the end, if you want to, you can tot up numbers of points. I mean, I haven't got the answer in terms of how many points you need to make. I don't think there is one, to be honest. If you write a side and a half and you litter it with content and style, and it's answering the question, you're going to get a very high mark, as long as your translation of the Latin is accurate or the Greek is accurate. Circling back to questions in terms of when you're reading in class out loud, so at the end of each paragraph, maybe, right, what have we just seen here? What's the point of this paragraph? And then you can link it into when you move on to the next paragraph. What's the immediate context been? Why is that of interest? How does that relate to what we're about to read? And again, it might be continuation or it might be contrast. Being a bit brutal with style points. So when people make them either orally or on paper, if they're not actually essentially worth the effort of making them, challenge that. Say, so what's the point of that? Okay, fine, you've identified an anaphora, or being a little bit irreverent at times, I think, is quite effective in showing that they've got to actually do something with them. With the idea of selectivity, you can be tough and say, right, imagine you've only got half the time available to write this answer. You can only write 5 points. What are your best 5 points here? Or what are your best 3 points here? That tends to be a useful synopsis type activity and prioritization type activity. For the idea of brevity, you could say, okay, I want you to write a paragraph on this, not in exam format, but I want you to write a 10-line paragraph on this and try and squeeze in 10 mini style points, which you can definitely do just by making it succinct and treating the reader and the examiner as someone who's intelligent enough to get the style point very quickly. And then finally, you could be, in terms of the idea of quoting phrases, you could, not that you do this in the exam, but you could say, like, right, for this exercise, don't just quote me a single word. Your points must all be 2 or 3 words. They must be contrasting. They must be say, quoting words that support each other or parallel words, but don't just give me one word. And then you're hopefully limiting the idea of fixation. Now I've got a few suggestions about extra activities you could do, some of which are in the above, but there's others here which you could do. This is mainly to stretch the teaching so that then the writing is of course developed all the way along. So we said to use some English and maybe unseen English as well. Use a filter. Now you could say, look, for this 15-mark practice, I just want you to talk about word order, if you can, and see how many word order points you could get from that paragraph. And I bet actually you could write a side and a half about word order in a 15-line paragraph, in a 15-line passage. Or you could say, just talk about choice of words. Or you could go the other way and say, I'm going to ban you from talking about your lit-crit devices. You're not allowed to talk about lit-crit devices, so you have to describe the style and the use of language without these terms that you've been relying on for say, GCSE, and that you don't always explain the significance of. Of course, that's just a thing to train a range of approaches to style. Because if you just fixate on one or the other, you're missing that lovely sophistication and the blend you can certainly develop. And I'll show you in a sec how you can talk about style without really bothering or resorting to the devices. You can say, don't give me more than one example of this in a 15 marker. I don't want more than one example of a superlative or a repetition or a contrast. So you can actively require them to have a real range of points, because sometimes you find people develop favorite points and then fixate on that and then look for it. It's their kind of safety blanket of a point. We've talked about the idea of summarizing different sections. So you could ask them to do an introduction almost for every 10 lines of the text. And there's only, I guess, for each text, there's about 250 odd lines. So you could say, right, I'm going to give you 25 chunks of it, or 15 chunks of it. Just write your intro for each of those. Because almost certainly that's going to essentially be answering an exam question, because exam questions are always going to be sufficiently broad. You could pick out 2 translations. You could think about success of conveying X or Y, and then that, of course, sparks a really interesting question about what success means for a translator. And then finally, you could do a bit of a sort of internal contrast. I mean, Cicero earlier on does this. Do we have the same style points arising later on? You know, is it less stylistic? Is it more pedestrian here? Why might that be? Is he getting into narrative rather than argument? That sort of thing. So there are various ways you can make commentaries, I guess, varied in terms of a filter to essentially set. I'm conscious I've been talking for a long time. No one has butted in. Does anyone want to butt in at this point? The cat. Kathy's got a cat. Sorry, if you've got your gallery mode on. Thank you for the cat. What's the cat's name, Kathy? Sorry.
This is Mrs. Ruby. She's very pleased to meet you.
Excellent. I hope she's enjoying the Latin and Greek A-level chat. Okay, so I'm going to try and limit myself to another sort of 10, 15 minutes or so max. I've done this exercise in previous CPD I've done before, so apologies if you have seen it, but it's worth reminding students that style doesn't just have to be literary devices or those bits of jargon they have learnt. And the style essentially is any discussion of the use of language and purpose of language. So if students are finding it hard to express that, then these 3 questions work pretty well. What's an author aiming at here? What could be a very simple or the simplest way of saying it? And, oh, okay, well, they're not using that simplest way, so why do they not? And then suddenly you've got a conversation about use of language, even without mentioning any style points. And deliberate choice of language. It's a very easy way in to scaffold a kind of style, or to get almost by stealth onto a style discussion. And then you can look at paragraphs of the text deliberately with a different filter on each time to kind of develop the sense that style is a range of approaches, and it's not just your terms. And I'll show you just quickly what I mean by that. So this is an early section of the Procluentio, which I'm sure many of you are reading, and I'm not going to dwell on particular points, but one this is just to show you the approach. One filter could be to look at what the absolute skeleton, the bones of a paragraph are, and then what has been added in that's superfluous, technically superfluous to that, and why then has Cicero added that in. And if you were to do this exercise and kind of gut the paragraph, I reckon that everything in bold and underlined is essential. So you've got Ea, she, everything else technically not required grammatically in the sentence. She, captured by love of Melinas, at first contained herself. And that is the bare bones of that sentence. And it does actually make sense, just limited to that. So everything else has been deliberately included for a particular reason. Why is that? Is it to add a point about the morality, or to add a caveat, or to add a pause in as the sentence builds up? Whatever the reason, it's been added in deliberately, and it's not required. So it's conscious, and it's could be therefore remarked upon about the construction of a paragraph or the construction of a line. And the same thing goes on later on. And then suddenly you've got the interesting question of, oh, why has he chosen to include it? A second filter is to look just in the sense of word order, diction and word choice. So in this paragraph, it's very, very rich. You've got yellow words are to do with family or family relations. Blue words are to do with maybe abstract nouns to do with morality or restraint. Good words, essentially. Green words are to do with pain or with things which are frowned upon. And so you've got patterns of text. And you could do this all the way through. If you were then taking a thematic approach for your lit crit answer, which you definitely could do, I think it's harder, but you can certainly, and you risk potentially omitting some good points, but you could certainly do it and get top marks. If you were then thinking about themes of word order, this sort of exercise is useful for training that. Or you could look simply at word order and say, look, I want you to pick only points of word order in this paragraph. And again, you can do the same thing. So even in that first line, you've got the two genitives there, which seem like they're kind of in parallel, but actually they're not really, because you've got the mother of habitus, and then the Melini is sort of captured by love of Melina. So you've got them working as genitives in slightly different ways, but you've got them deliberately contrasted by word order, arguably. Or later on, in that final line, when you've got hominum fama, for example, filii dolor, filii mairo, you've got parallel word order there. And with the nominatives following the genitives, you can apply a word order filter very easily. And as I said earlier, probably pick out enough points to fill the best part of a 15 marker. And my acronym of WOE, word order for emphasis, is what you end up writing almost everywhere on the text. Especially in prose, I think it's important to think about the shape of a paragraph, and this is often something that people miss because it's sort of not seeing the wood for the trees. So if you just took this paragraph, what is Cicero doing here? Well, you've got your initial restraint when she's captured and then she contains herself, but you've got signposting of first and then next, and then you have your impact of that. She's beginning to blaze, and then all these result clauses stringing together. This is not potentially the most exciting example, but it is a way of introducing the idea of, right, in these first 2.5 lines, Cicero is commenting on how initially Sassia was able to keep herself back, but then it declines into great sin. And if you've almost mapped the paragraphs like this, then it's a way to introduce that type of conversation. Finally, then you've got your lit crit devices, and then you could look for things like, here's your alliterations, the use of the avoidance, for example, of Sassia's name, so talking about her, so almost like periphrasis, almost, that mother of habitus. You could talk about caveats put in, or asides, the nequated ipsum diu, that's a sort of parenthesis potentially. You've got your sound effects, your alliteration, you've got your anaphora of your known and your P's, and then your F's, and there's a bit of chiasmus there as well to weave in, with macula familiae hominum fama. So the chiasmus of nom gen nom, which itself creates this pattern of the F's as well. So there's tons, of course, to talk about in terms of lit crit, but it's only one aspect, and could have definitely come on top of much more, I think, fundamental analyses of style. Right. A few minutes on the 20 markers, because I think essentially they're not rocket science without seeming to be too flippant. If you know the text really well and you have planned in advance some thoughts about it in a good range, then you should be able on the day, even if it's a slightly left field question, to be able to react enough and to produce a very sensible and thorough response to that. Of course, the lack of choice means that, and you could have quite a range of titles. It means that you've got to prepare mind map quite a good range in advance, and they, I think, tend to come in 3 main categories. Sometimes about particular characters, sometimes about themes, sometimes slightly more ones about the genre or the text as a whole, and what is the author's style or the craft they've been deploying. and those are possibly the ones which are least attractive, if you like, to students. I find they're a bit more technical. Important to obviously have covered the English section really thoroughly, and then to incorporate it very liberally in the essay. I have in the past recommended about a third of the examples should probably come from that English section, just to really signpost that you have covered it and you've thought about it as a whole, not just a sort of bolt on. Good range of selection from across the work really makes you look like you have thought synoptically across the whole piece. As we heard in the GCSE talk just before 5 o'clock, I think there's no need for quotation. Close reference or paraphrase will do just fine. But if there are some choice words that can be dropped in, that's great. I also think some of these questions do lend themselves well to being quite argumentative. So, I mean, the best essays are not afraid to do that. And imagine your examiner who's marked 100 of these and they've been basically the same. And then they get a slightly more provocative introduction and a punchy argument featuring lots of good points. They're going to be delighted by that. So I think there's no fear to be slightly bold in answering, so long as things are justified. You can essentially argue anything you want, so long as it's justified. Obviously, in the exam, planning time is really well. It's an essential idea. Having a strong intro where you're outlining your main points, but also any particular key terms in the question. Then analyze what would this abstract noun mean in this sense, in this context. Then some chunky paragraphs and then a relatively brief conclusion is obviously a useful structure to have. And there's no, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no exact science about length or number of points. But essentially, if they're writing a couple of sides and it's full of examples, they're going to be able to hit the top bands. A couple of final thoughts. Mentioned the idea of kind of 3 different types of question. It's very useful to actually go through these 3 categories. Sorry, I've got loud students in the corridor. I'm not sure if you can hear them. They should be going home. So 3 kind of types of question, maybe a character, theme, and authorial style or craft, to say to students, right, we're going to create 10 questions of each, or 5 questions on each as a revision exercise once we've finished a good chunk of the text, and then you can come back to it later on. I mean, you can, of course, start writing essays on half the text before you've read the whole thing. Also, being slightly nasty, you could, once they've created a question that they would not want to come up, make them write that question, and then probably the real exam is going to be a bit more generous in terms of the actual wording of the question. And in terms of those 3 categories, I've got some examples down below for the A-level Plutarch. So something about Alcibiades, for example, like him or loathe him. Then the second question is more a theme across the whole text, which is inviting a slightly more abstract discussion. And then the third question is a bit more about evaluating the text itself in terms of its genre or the author's craft. So is it more history or entertainment, for example? I mean, if you did lots of creation of those types of questions as a group, and then you got them to write up a few of them, but more importantly, mind map a lot, then you should be in a good place for the 20 marker. I'm going to stop speaking because it's 5:30 and I've been speaking for half an hour. I'm conscious that lots of you probably have good ideas, and I can certainly help chip in, but I've got a few. If we're struggling for topics of conversation, those are things we might want to mention. But firstly, does anyone have any particular questions or thoughts or things to add? Deathly silent.
I just wanted to chip in and say, Henry, thanks so much so far for that. I mean, like some really great suggestions and tips there. And certainly I will be, I'll share this this PowerPoint with people as we go. So hopefully people might, any points or discussion things that you've done for people, how you might have approached stuff in your classrooms, and please feel free to contribute.
Or we can all go home. Sorry. So I say, has anyone, if someone's really struggling with lit crit, has anyone done things that are helpful as crutches?
I think one thing is often at A level, actually, we're quite fortunate, and it's kind of self-selecting, isn't it? They don't end up doing Latin A level unless they've kind of got the basics. Certainly, it's been my experience.
You'd hope so, but I mean, I've had students who have been quite weak, and the lit crit have been clutching at sort of one word they can see and talk about. So they're not then creating that lovely fluent commentary. They are still working through and creating it sort of very point by point, and that's been a challenge. So I guess I've used some of these approaches here, but you're right. Often they are pretty articulate and able already.
I think it's the balance of, as you say, seeing the wood for the trees, and getting both in, get the detail but also the overview, and practice.
I think personally, I think one of the struggles is as much with the higher level achievers at GCSE is moving away from that way of thinking. Like, something that you've highlighted quite a lot is not just going for kind of spotting the style points and listing them and discussing them in a short space. Actually getting away from that GCSE mindset. I've found recently that's been probably the biggest challenge, as much for kind of the higher level. And not all higher level pupils, but some of them still get stuck in that sort of more basic kind of mind frame, I think. So this idea of actually being broader and expanding out, zooming out a lot more, and developing your thoughts in a sort of broader way, I think is an important point.
Yeah, and even when if you're giving, say, sentence starters or scaffolding a response, you could say, what in the first line of a paragraph, just simply say what this sentence says or does. So content, and then the content's probably going to be of interest in terms of, oh, this is a terribly un-Roman idea, or a terribly popular idea in Rome, or something of an analysis about the character, and then do the style as the second half of a sentence simply. And there's no harm in saying, Cicero goes on to say, and you're giving a slight paraphrase of what the sentence does. It shows that you're fully in control of it as a commentator, and then tacking on your star points throughout. Yeah, but they're a bit scared to do that, aren't they? Sometimes.
Yeah, particularly strongly linguistic pupils, and particularly if they're not perhaps they're not taking other humanities, not quite so used to writing longer essays or so confident at it, seem to kind of, I find it hard to get them to develop their points fully. They sort of seem to feel like they've made enough of a point when it's still quite thin, still quite like I say, GCSE okay, but A level, it's it needs more development. It's encouraging coming up with different ways to explain how to develop and increase the point through. I sort of end up talking about giving more context a lot, and trying to illustrate different ways of doing that. I think that's quite a big obstacle I've found recently.
Yeah, and saying that kind of like final third of a point, if you've got your content and then your style, and that final third could be then linking back to something. It could be contrasting. It could be explaining how you're building on something you've already touched on earlier. So you're giving that slightly deeper analysis rather than just identifying. You're then actually evaluating a bit more. Yeah, that's a really good point.
I'm wondering if it's possible if you could tell us a little bit more about what you think about an introduction for a 15 marker might be, because I noticed we've been through examiners' reports and they say, okay, you don't give long, lengthy introductions or whatever. So I just wonder what your thoughts on what you would expect to see in an introduction.
So I'd keep it relatively brief, but I do think it's you're not going to get explicitly marks for it, but it's vital in terms of setting yourself up. I think the key thing is, in this paragraph or in this section, Cicero, Virgil are describing X, Y, and Z, and either something like this is contrasting with something that's gone on before, or he's aiming to illustrate this, and that's 3 or 4 lines, and that's enough to start to focus your mind. You don't have to go into
so sort of setting, setting the scene, basically.
Absolutely, scene setting. If there's something that's very important that's just happened before the passage, that's probably worth sticking in. We've just had the character assassination of Sassia. In this section, he's moving on to the crimes of X and Y, and he's going to point out Y or Z. So essentially a slight paraphrase of what the passage is saying, plus anything that's particularly pertinent about it. You don't have to start making particular points in it, and you don't really have to say, in this essay I will do this and this. It's more scene setting, I think.
Scene setting. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder if people find that, because I quite often find that what they do is they list a whole range of style points. So, in this passage, Virgil or whoever uses this X, Y, Z style points, and you're going to get no marks for that, because you're going to go on and expand on each of those. So I think you're right, encouraging them to actually set the context of the whole passage and show their broader understanding of the whole text is probably a better way to go with the introduction than trying to kind of just reel off a whole, sort of almost summarize the points I'm about to make. Yeah.
And if it comes back to the idea of the author's aim, well, that will probably perfectly chime with the question, because the question is probably something as bland as, how is this dramatic or enlivening this feature? And if then you can say Cicero is aiming to do X and Y and present Sassia in the worst possible light, then that's almost prompting or triggering you to then be doing that in your lit crit and explaining the value of certain points. And it's putting all of your lit crit points then in context. So the points are aiming towards something in particular, not just random. And you can practice as introductions without then doing, of course, the whole 15 marker.
One of the things I've done, Henry, which sort of links with what you were talking about, is in a section, rather than saying sort of, why is this here? I'll often say, what would be missing if this section weren't here? And I think sometimes when you put it in that way, they can often see, between things and the wood for the trees, because I think sometimes they don't quite get what's there until they go, well, actually, then I wouldn't have noticed the X, or, this simile means that we haven't got this description. And that has seemed to have supported those that are struggling with the lit crit or struggling to remember the content.
That's a brilliant suggestion, actually. Blank it out. What would be missing if it's not there? Also, what else could plausibly be there? If you're thinking about the whole structure of a text, that's a really good suggestion. Thank you.
No problem.